Good afternoon and welcome back to U.S. History 10. Today, guys, we're going to pick up where we left off last week and we're going to continue with the Civil War. So very quickly before we get back into the Civil War, we're going to talk about where we at in the Civil War last week. We picked up, of course, with the Battle of Fort Sumter. At this point, Lincoln is not wanting to vacate any of the forts in the South. Of course, at this point, all of the forts in the South, these military institutions, are a part of the Confederacy geographically. So, of course, the Union wants to protect those forts. The South wants to take over these forts. A battle ensues at Fort Sumter, and the first shots of the war are fired. Now, before we dig back into and move into new information, let's talk about what is going to be the plan of action for the North. Last week, we talked about some of the advantages the North had and some of the advantages the South had. Now, one of the big things that we got into was something called the Anaconda Plan. The Anaconda Plan, what this is going to do, guys, this is set up by a general named Winfield Scott for the Union Army. And the whole point of this plan is to basically cut off the Confederacy. If we can cut off the Confederacy, we can break the Confederacy down and possibly end this war. Remember, no one thinks this war is going to drag out. They think this war is going to be quick, fast, and done. But unfortunately, we're going to see it's going to drag out for 4 years. So what does this Anaconda Plan actually entail? So just a reminder, the first thing, guys, if we look at Arrow 1, the first thing that they want to do is block the Confederacy by putting up a naval blockade. Remember, we've talked about blockades before in U.S. history. It happened during the American Revolution. It happened during the War of 1812. And we're going to see it again here in the Civil War. If you block the ports, nothing can come in and nothing can come out. And you've got to remember with the South, not a lot of industry in the South. So they need supplies. They're going to have to get supplies from other nations. If you can't get supplies in, you're going to, of course, hurt the war cause in the Confederacy. Now, if we look at Arrow 2, another thing here, of course, cutting the Confederacy in half. If you can split the Confederacy, you can split the forces, and that's going to create a great disadvantage for the Confederate forces by splitting them in two. And then finally, it's going to be a war for the capitals. We're going to get more into this in just a second, but if you look at Arrow 3, guys, we're pointing right at Richmond, Virginia. And at this point, Richmond, Virginia is the capital of the Confederacy. So if the capital can fall, that could possibly lead to the fall of the government of the Confederacy and lead to the end of this war. So we're going to talk more about this three-part strategy as we go, and we're going to see how it's played out over the course of this lesson. All right, so before we actually get into battles themselves, we need to talk about revolution and warfare during the Civil War. From this point forward, guys, we're going to see, when we talk about American wars from the Civil War forward, you're going to see a lot of revolution, new technology, modern warfare that's going to advance the way that we fight. In all of the wars, of course, as you will see in U.S. History 11 last year, you're going to see a lot of wars in American history, and you're going to see a lot of new technology emerge. Now, during the Civil War, one of the biggest advances that's going to happen is going to be the creation of the rifle. With the rifle, of course, if you know anything about football, let's use this analogy here. If you think about a football, if someone like Drew Brees throws a football, okay, most accurate quarterback in the NFL, how does he throw that football? When he throws it, it's going to spiral, and that's going to help him get right to where it needs to go. That's essentially what the rifling on the inside of the barrel of the gun does. That creates more accuracy, and that's obviously going to lead to more death and destruction as a result. Another thing, too, the Minet ball, this is a more destructive bullet. It actually kind of breaks apart in the body, so it's going to be more destructive and actually cause more damage. We also see the introduction of grenades and landmines being used. And another advantage and another tactic that's going to play out is going to be fighting from trenches. Basically what this does is creates barricades, and it's a new advancement in infantry attacks. It's going to be, of course, easier to protect yourself. You have that shield so you can fight back and forth. You're going to see that again play out in World War I when you talk about trench warfare there. All right, so how are we going to break this war up? The biggest and the easiest way to remember to remember the different fronts or, of course, the different theaters of this war, the different areas that this war is going to be fought, is thinking about it in the East and the West. Remember that Anaconda Plan we talked about. We're blocking from the East. The capitals, both Washington, D.C. and Richmond, are in the West, or in the East, excuse me. And then, of course, we're going to try to break the Confederacy down from the West. So we're going to kind of break this war up as we talk about it into the war into the East and the war into the West. So we talked about the Battle of Fort Sumter. That happens in April of 1861. But we want to talk about the first major battle between the Union forces and the Confederate forces. That's going to play out at Bull Run, right outside of Washington, D.C., July 21st, 1861. And basically what's happening here, guys, the Union Army is headed to Richmond. Again, this is going to be a battle for the capitals. We'll see this more in just a second. I'm going to illustrate this for you on a map to show you exactly how close the Union capital and the Confederate capital were to each other. Now, at this point, when they're meeting, these two armies are meeting in July of 1861, you have two very inexperienced armies meeting. So this is going to cause a lot of problems, basically chaos at the Battle of Bull Run as this battle plays out. Now, the two big players in this battle is going to be the gentleman up here at the top. This is Confederate General Thomas Jackson. We're going to get to know him a little bit better later on, and you might know him better by his nickname, Stonewall Jackson. And the reason that he gains this nickname is at the Battle of Bull Run, he's going to hold his line like a stone wall. He's going to show his resilience, and that's a big thing we got to remember too about the South. Good generals, that's going to be one of the advantages the South has, is of course going to be their good generals and of course their good leadership they have when it comes to military actions. Now, Stonewall Jackson is going to hold that line, and it's going to be a Confederate victory. So you have to think about this first interaction between these two armies. You're going to see a Confederate victory. So that's a morale boost for the Confederate Army and only going to push them forward. Remember, everybody thinks this war is going to be quick. Doesn't really look so great for the Union at this point. Now, after the Battle of Bull Run, it becomes very apparent that Washington, D.C. has got to be protected. Let me go to this, let's go to this map real quick so I can show you and we'll come back. Let's take a look at those capitals because it's going to make it a lot easier for you to understand. When we're talking about Richmond, we're talking about Washington. Why is this so important? Because the proximity of how close they were to each other. If we look at the race for the capitals, we look at the right side of the map here, guys. We're going to see, of course, in blue, the capital, of course, Washington, D.C., the Union capital. But if you look just south of Washington, D.C., there's the capital of the Confederacy. They're very close to each other. So the majority of the fighting in the East, you're going to see happen in this proximity around, of course, the northern part of Virginia and into the lower part of Maryland. Now, we are going to see fighting go up in Pennsylvania when we talk about Gettysburg, but a lot of the fighting in the East is going to take place here around Washington and Richmond. It's a constant back and forth of protecting each other's capitals. Let's go back for just a second. And again, after the Battle of Bull Run, considering how close it is to D.C., Lincoln knows we've got to protect this capital if we're going to maintain this war. So after the Battle of Bull Run, Lincoln's actually going to call for 1 million additional soldiers. Like we saw last week after Fort Sumter, people in the North came out in droves to join the Union cause, as we saw in the Confederacy as well. And before we know it, this army is going to be building. And what Lincoln's going to do is he's going to appoint General George McClellan to lead the Army of the Potomac. What exactly is the Potomac? Do you remember what that is? Washington plays a big role with Washington, D.C. Well, that's actually the river that Washington, D.C. sits on, so they're trying to protect this area. That's why it's called the Army of the Potomac. So let's talk a little bit more about the war for the capitals. So McClellan, after he's appointed general, he's going to wait 5 months to attack Richmond. Again, Richmond's the capital of the Confederacy. Take the capital down, we can take down the Confederacy. And this is going to be a little frustrating for Lincoln. We're going to see how that's going to play out in just a little bit. Now, also in the spring of 1862, Robert E. Lee is going to take command of the Southern Army. He's going to be the most predominant, the most infamous general that we talk about, maybe infamous, not the correct word, but the most well-known general that we're going to talk about in the Confederate Army. Now, Lee and McClellan are going to have their first clashes during the spring of 1862. They're going to have a massive battle, the 7 Days Battle. The Union's actually going to leave the Richmond area, and that's really a perk, and that's really a morale boost again for the Confederates. Early on in the war, the Confederacy was playing out very well when it came to battles. One thing, unfortunately, that we don't get to do in these lessons is talk about all those battles. Do you know how many battles and skirmishes actually played out in the Civil War between the Union and the Confederacy? Over 8,000 recorded different skirmishes. So it would take us there's Civil War historians that study this their whole lives that probably don't go through all the battles themselves. So it's kind of tough to make sure that we talk about all these to put it in, and one nice, concise package to help you guys understand this. But again, we're going to hit the big ones here. So early on, the Confederacy, they've got a pretty decent lead here when it comes to victories in the East. Now, Antietam, though, is going to take a step back. That's going to take a step back for the Confederacy. The Battle of Antietam is going to take place in September of 1862. Now, Lee had won the Second Battle of Bull Run just before the Battle of Antietam, right outside of Antietam. So another, again, a morale boost for the Confederacy. But when Lee and McClellan clash at Antietam, this is going to turn into another disaster situation. This is still to this day the bloodiest single-day battle in American history. When you go back and look at the casualties, you look at the actual death rate, the mortality rate in this battle, it's massive. So it's basically, the bad part about it is you have all this death and destruction, but at the same time, the battle's a standoff. No one really necessarily wins this battle. And unfortunately for the Union, the Confederacy is going to retreat, and McClellan, he doesn't even pursue the Confederacy at this point. And by the time that we get to Antietam, this massive battle with this high mortality rate, Lincoln's kind of fed up with McClellan. He's not pushing forward. He's not being proactive. He's not being on the offensive here. He's not, you know, pursuing the Confederacy the way that he should to try to, of course, end this war as quickly as possible. So we get rid of McClellan, and he's going to be out of the picture. Now, we've already looked at this map, guys, but just to kind of show you again, we were talking about the race for the capital. It's just proximity for you guys to remind you where we're at. Washington, D.C., of course, the capital of the Union. Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy in the east. This is where the bulk of the fighting is going to take place. Now, of course, there's going to be fighting later on. We talk about Sherman's March to the Sea down in Georgia. We're going to talk about Mobile here in just a little bit, fighting in this area. But when we talk about the eastern campaign of the war, this is where the bulk of the fighting will take place. All right, so let's move to the west. We're going to move to Tennessee. We're going to move to the Mississippi River Valley area and talk about the war in the west. Remember, this is part of the Anaconda Plan. Let's break the Confederacy in two to break it down. Now, in the spring of 1862, Lincoln is going to appoint General Ulysses S. Grant, a guy that we're going to hear a lot more about later on because he's going to become president of the United States. He's going to appoint him a decisive commander in the West. This guy right here, very decisive, is going to build a name for himself in the West. And before too long, he's going to have control over the East. By the time that we get to 1864, he'll become the commander of all the Union armies. Now, February of 1862, Grant's going to capture two very important Confederate forts. He's going to capture Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. Very important points in Tennessee, so that way his army is going to be able to move southwest, move into the Mississippi River Valley region, and start moving down the Mississippi River. You're going to see on the map here in just a second, the whole point of this is hopefully to converge both the Union Army and the Union Navy up the Mississippi River to attack Vicksburg, bring down Vicksburg, which we're going to see in 1863, and that's going to lead to the splitting of the West in the Confederacy. Now, another major battle that Grant's going to fight in the West of spring of 1862 is going to be the Battle of Shiloh. This battle right here, guys, again, almost like another disaster situation, because what this does, we see that in this battle, it's just massive destruction. We understand after the destructive nature of this battle at Shiloh in Tennessee, that better preparation is going to have to take place on both sides if either side is going to actually win this war. And another thing that it shows is that the Confederacy is very vulnerable in the West. A lot of breakdown in the West, the scattering, of course, of troops. And you have to remember, too, when it comes to troop numbers, who has more, a larger population at this point that can provide troops? Is it the North or is it the South? It's the North. So the South is already at a disadvantage by having fewer troops than the North. So what Grant's doing, guys, if you look at the top here where it says Battles of the West, you can see where Fort Henry and Fort Donelson exist. And what he's going to do, Grant is going to swing his troops around, and eventually he's going to make his way through the Mississippi River Valley region, head south down the Mississippi River, and meet up at Vicksburg in the summer of 1863. But somebody's going to come and help him at the same time. If we look down here at the second map, guys, where it says the fall of New Orleans, what we can see is that in April of today is actually the anniversary of this attack, April 29th, 1862, David Farragut, who we're going to talk about a little bit later with the Battle of Mobile Bay, is going to sail into New Orleans, take New Orleans, and New Orleans is going to fall. Why is New Orleans so important? Because it's one of the most important and the biggest ports in the Confederacy at this point. So again, if you can't get things in and out of the port, that's going to break down the Confederacy even more. So eventually the point is going to be here to bring Farragut up the Mississippi River, bring Grant down the Mississippi River, and then they're going to converge again at Vicksburg in April of 1863. That's what's going to, again, split the Confederacy in two and start to bring the Confederacy, wear it down more and more. All right, so we've already really talked about this, guys. We talked about New Orleans. Farragut's going to come in and attack New Orleans in April of 1862, take down this major port in the south. Quickly, he's going to move up the Mississippi River, take Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and then take Natchez, Mississippi as well. Now, before we move out of this and we move into a little bit about the politics of war, let's talk about the ironclads real quick, another technology. This is, again, when we were talking about modern war technology that emerges during this time period, the ironclad is going to be new shipping technology. These are really cool ships. They actually can withstand cannon. They can resist burning. And one of the first major attacks between two of these new warships is going to happen in March of 1862, right outside of D.C. at the battle. It's going to be a battle between the Monitor for the North and the South's Merrimac. And again, ironclads were used somewhat in the war, but it's not going to be one of the major technologies that we see play out as we dig deeper into the war at sea. All right, so we do want to try to get through this today, guys, try to get as far as we can into this and talk a little bit about the politics of war. Anytime we talk about war, we've got to talk about the politics of it. Now, one of the big things that the South wants to do at this point is try to get Britain into the war cause to support the South. Why does Britain want to help the South? Well, you have to remember at this point, the South is still exporting a ton of, well, they were exporting a ton of cotton before the war broke out to Great Britain. Textile industry is huge in Great Britain, and that's where they got the bulk of their cotton from. So the South naturally assumed that Great Britain was going to support them because they provided them with a lot of cotton. But we're going to see that Great Britain's going to actually stay neutral. Now, one of the big reasons they're going to stay neutral is because of the Emancipation Proclamation that's issued in January of 1863. This is issued by Lincoln in 1863, and the point of this is to free slaves behind Confederate lines. Now, again, this creates some problems. It doesn't free slaves in border states, and it has to be area that's actually occupied by the Union at this point for the slaves to be free. So it's not a complete abolition of slavery. A lot of people have that misconception about the Emancipation Proclamation. All it does is simply attempt to end slavery in the areas where it already exists. Now, Lincoln's views on slavery are what's going to lead him to this conclusion. At this point, the federal government had no power to abolish slavery where it already existed. Lincoln decides that the Army can emancipate slaves who labor for the Confederacy. And really, the emancipation is going to discourage Britain from supporting the South at this point because Great Britain had abolished slavery within their empire almost 20 years prior to the American Civil War. So they don't want to get involved in a cause that actually still supports the institution of slavery. So the Emancipation Proclamation, the big thing that we need to remember about this, guys, is that it brings a moral cause to the war. It's going to push more people into the war cause to try to end this war as quickly as possible. Now, when we talk about life during the war, we got to talk very quickly about problems on both sides. War, of course, life is going to be disrupted, as we're kind of seeing right now. Anytime we have big events in history, life gets disrupted, and that's what we see, of course, during the wartime efforts during the Civil War. Now, there's good and bad reactions concerning the Emancipation Proclamation. A lot of people in the North praise it. A lot of people in the South feel it's a further threat to, of course, this institution that their economy thrives on at this point. And we start to see dissent on both sides. What do we mean by dissent? Dissent is all that is people that go against official opinion. So we've got a lot of people that are pushing back against the Emancipation Proclamation, this push to, of course, end slavery. And you've got a lot of Democrats in the North that really just kind of want this war to be over with. They don't want to antagonize their Southern fellow Democrats. So they actually start calling out President Lincoln, and things get kind of bad. Lincoln's trying to keep the country together as much as possible and bring the country together. These guys are kind of bad-mouthing the cause, and Lincoln wants to shut that down. Now, some people have a lot of issue with this. They say, well, it's, against our freedom of speech, or, breaking down our rights, us not being able to express our rights about how we feel about this war. But Lincoln is going to do some things that it's going to, of course, try to keep the war cause together and essentially try to silence these individuals that are pushing back against this cause. So what he's going to do is suspend the writs of habeas corpus. What that means, guys, is that if you go to court, you are supposed to know exactly what charges are being brought against you, and of course, why you're going to court. What is the point of this? Why am I actually being dragged into court, and why am I being tried? You have those rights as American citizens. By not having the writs of habeas corpus in place, you have no protection over that. They can put you in jail and not tell you why. And a lot of people in the North called Copperheads, these are Northern Democrats, are going to be arrested as a result of this pushback by President Lincoln to kind of calm these sympathies, Southern sympathies in the North. We try to keep the Union together, let's not break it any more apart than it already is. Now, another thing that's going to cause some problems is the idea of conscription. What is subscription? It's a draft. This is where you pull people into the military. And by the time that we get to about 1862, 1863, massive battles have happened. We've had a loss, of course, massive losses of soldiers on both sides. So both sides are going to have to bring in individuals. And one of the ways they're going to do that is draft individuals into the military. Now, both sides could actually hire substitutes. If they were an older person, they could hire someone to go in for them. A lot of times in the South, slaves would be sent in to substitute. Or if you were a major planter in the South, if you had a massive plantation with more than 20 slaves, you could actually be exempt from going into the draft. And that's going to anger a lot of poor Southerners and cause even more discontent in the South. All right, guys, so we only have a few more minutes left, but I want to talk about, before we get into the very end of the war, which we're going to finish up next week, talk about Lincoln's assassination, the legacy of the war, and then we're going to start talking about Reconstruction. Let's talk about life during the war at this point. In the North, guys, things are a little bit better than they are in the South. The South is starting to fall apart. Their economy's falling apart. Agriculture is bad. We'll talk about that more in just a moment. But in the North, guys, we've got the economy booming. You'll see this in American history, multiple different incidences in American history where we go to war, we see a boost in the economy because we need war supplies made. You'll especially see this during World War II when you move into that material your junior year, when you move into that next year. And here, what we're going to see is the northern economies boom, and they're creating more goods left and right. And we're going to start to see some positive changes that are really going to play out when we talk about that modernization of warfare, where we start to see the North, they're actually going to establish something called the Sanitary Commission. And this is basically going to improve sanitary conditions on the front. And this is going to save a lot of people's lives, because sadly, more people die during the Civil War from diseases than they actually do from their wounds in battle. So if we can bring down the rate of disease, we're starting into the age of modern medicine, we can actually improve these conditions and make life a little bit better on the fields. And Clara Barton's going to be one of the leaders in this movement. She is a nurse working on the battlefield. She's a Union nurse, and she is going to improve upon these sanitary conditions. And what we're going to see later on is she's actually going to start the American branch of the American Red Cross, which is going to be vital and important, still plays a big role today. When we see disaster situations, the Red Cross is always there to help. To finish this up today, guys, let's talk about the South and where the South is at this point. We've got a lot of struggle, a lot of strife happening in the South. You've got to remember the South is mainly agricultural. At this point, when men are out of the field and slaves are out of the field, you can't really grow agriculture. The economy is going to start to collapse. You're going to see huge food shortages. Slaves are going to start pushing back. You're actually going to see resistance from slaves on the plantations pushing back, especially as Union soldiers start moving deeper into the South. So you're starting to see a lot of pushback towards the institution of slavery within the institution itself. Now, as I was saying just a moment ago, and this is going to be the last point that we're going to talk about today, is the food shortages in the South. This is going to be rampant all over the South as food becomes less available, as we start to see these shortages grow larger and larger throughout the South. We're going to see riots. Actually, in September of 1863, there's a bread riot right here in Mobile, Alabama, that is going to cause major chaos in this town over food shortages and basically women and children starving and just wanting food. Now, when we come back next week, guys, we're going to talk a little bit more about the end of the war. We're going to finish the war up and start getting into Reconstruction. We still have got 3 weeks left, guys. We're going to finish up our objectives, Can't wait to talk to you next week about the end of the war and Reconstruction. Guys, have a great week.